Welcome back, Generals and Admirals. This is General Johnny, and today we are going over a really fun topic. We are going over the infantry tactics, and we're going to look specifically at Broken Arrow today, but really these are infantry tactics that are universal, and they can apply to really any game and actual real-life infantry tactics. So a lot of the concepts here we'll go over today are pretty common and basic throughout the infantry. So but again, we'll look at Broken Arrow, kind of how to use it specifically within the game, some of the stats that you're going to want to know when you're looking at the infantry units, and then just basic tactics and strategy when you're using them inside the game. And we'll even pull up not in-game footage, but we'll pull up a test environment, and we'll look at kind of how the infantry performs, go over the different categories of infantry and how you should be using it to maximize your ability in the game. Alright, so before we go into the actual game, I'm just going to discuss a few basic things about infantry tactic, again, that apply to this game, but other games as well, that you're going to need to know. The basic concept is that you need a fire and maneuver element. So what does that mean? As infantry advances on an objective, if they come into contact, they are going to receive some kind of degraded mission capability. Okay, this happens in real life. This happens in the game. It's simulated on what that means. But if you're getting shot at by an enemy, you are not going to perform as effective as if you were just taking a stroll in the woods. So to mitigate that, you need to have a unit that is covering your maneuvering unit, so the moving unit, while they maneuver. So we call this, again, fire maneuver. Usually looks something like a support by fire and a maneuver element. And they always say no maneuver without fire, no fire without maneuver. Now, the fire or the suppression for that moving unit can be either through artillery, that's indirect fire, it can be from direct fire, it can be from any platform, any weapon system at all. The point is to suppress the enemy and negate their ability to suppress you while you move against them. Inside the game specifically, the way this shows up is the suppression. So there's two categories of suppression. There is shocked and there is panicked. When your units are shocked, they're going to display this yellow flashing kind of image on their icon. That is going to, again, be just a degraded effectiveness. Their reload times are going to be extended, so they're not going to shoot as often. This is particularly important when you're fighting against tanks and other armored vehicles. If your launchers are firing from, let's say, a 3-second reload and firing time to target, and that gets extended now to, let's say, 6 seconds, that's double the amount of time. A normal engagement that they would win, they may now lose because they're getting hit and they're not responding with their effective weapon system, especially when you factor in APS. So yeah, that's pretty much the whole thing with being shocked. Now, panicked, when you're panicked, and also your movement speed is going to degrade when you're shocked. When you're panicked, your movement speed is nearly zero. Your reload time is extended. Again, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a very noticeable. You're barely firing at all. So especially with, again, the AT infantry, if they go into a state of panic, they may not be able to destroy the enemy at all. Meanwhile, they're still receiving damage and they are likely to die. So those are your two categories of suppression. We'll go into the game and kind of talk basic infantry tactics as far as suppression, but really you need to either have suppression through covering fire or you need to utilize smoke. And we'll kind of talk about when to use either one of those, because you don't always use smoke to, let's say, attack an infantry in a building. One thing very important to understand outright, and we'll go ahead just looking at the units. I will focus mostly on the US. I plan on looking a little bit at the Russian side too, but infantry on the US, in my perspective, is a little bit easier to understand, so that's where we'll start, but a lot of this is transferable to whether you play US or Russia. So we'll go ahead and just talk about the units itself. I may pull up an actual deck build and kind of talk about the infantry I have in that build, but for right now, we're just going to pull up the arsenal and we're going to look through some of this infantry. I'm going to highlight some of the things I'm looking for when I'm trying to decide what infantry units to use and just kind of knowing what is good and what is bad. So first off, I just want to go over the different categories of infantry. So there's really 4 categories of infantry. You're going to have the anti-infantry infantry, I like to call the AI infantry. Okay, you're going to have anti-tank infantry, I like to call that anti-AT infantry. Now look, here's the thing with AT infantry, we'll go into a little bit depth later in the video, but not all anti-tank infantry is actually anti-tank. It's really just anti-armor. Now the degree of penetration and effectiveness against different platforms like IFVs or APCs or actual heavy main battle tanks is going to vary depending on which AT infantry, but broadly speaking, we have AT infantry as their second category. Then you also have anti-infantry infantry, and again, there are a bunch of different subcategories for anti-infantry infantry. We already went over anti-infantry infantry, but there's also close quarter infantry, there's medium range, and there's long range anti-infantry. The third category is going to be your anti-air infantry, so your AA infantry, and typically they carry some sort of man pads. Man pads is going to be your man-portable air defense system. So next category is going to be your recon infantry, and typically recon infantry is for spotting, identifying, gathering information on the enemy. enemy. And again, there are plenty of subcategories within each of those 4 categories, but broadly speaking, that's kind of what you need to know. Now, again, going into a little bit more depth of the anti-infantry, like I said, you have the CQB or close quarter combat type infantry. So that's going to be mostly your Marine Raiders, your Delta Force on the US side, the Engineers on the Russian side, and a few other units. But those are going to be really good in close quarters combat. So if you put them into a building, they have flashbangs. They typically have, depending on your loadout, you're going to have shotguns, and these things are really effective in close quarter combat. You're also going to have medium range infantry, okay? And this is, again, within the vein of anti-infantry. So you might have medium range, maybe these mech engineers, which aren't terrible close range either. They do have shotguns. And the same thing kind of goes for the combat engineers. Mech engineers are just a little bit lower of quality than the combat engineers, but largely fill the same role. Then you're going to have long range infantry. So you have things like the airborne NGSW, which is possibly medium to long range, depending how you want to categorize it. Same thing with your crew served weapons. Something important to note is with these crew served weapons, and I'm talking the Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher AGL, or the M2, basically the Browning machine gun. Any of these weapon systems, they need to be stationary for the units to actually utilize. So important to note, a lot of those, that also goes for the ATGMs. This would be classified as AT infantry, but is also long range in nature. Same thing with Javelin. Now, Javelin can actually shoot, I believe, as close as 100 meters. Yep, 100 to 1,300 meters. So just keep that in mind. And then you have your longer range infantry. I think I already mentioned NGSW. You have sniper rifles, obviously going to be long range infantry, but really a categorization of the recon. Troopers are also a little bit longer range, but that's really all you need to know about the anti-infantry. Okay, next on our list is anti-tank infantry. So I'll start out. This is probably a good category. This is a, interesting unit to talk about. Is the first unit that appears here is the assault small. So this unit, and really you want to be looking in the stats on the weapon systems to kind of get a feel for what they have. Anything with rocket launchers, you're going to be over here for the small, is going to be able to affect most armored vehicles. Now, there are light skin armored vehicle, medium skin armored vehicle, and heavy armored vehicles. For this one particularly, it actually can affect a lot because it has 600 damage. It's explosive damage, so it actually does really well against infantry, but it also can affect anything really but the heavy tanks. Now, interesting to note, with these AT infantry, they do get affected by the APS system. So the APS systems can actually be used up by any sort of rockets. It doesn't matter if that rocket damage is, let's say, 100 or if it's 600 as you have here. It will still eat up the APS, so that if you combine it with something that's got a higher damage rate, like let's say the Javelin, which is top attack and it has 750 damage, then it's going to be much more effective, because instead of the APS being used up on the Javelin, it'll be used up on the small. So that's kind of the deal with the AT infantry. You have kind of close range, medium range, long range, same way as before. Javelins is probably the most infamous AT infantry because of its top attack. You have the closer range smalls that does better against IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, or armored personnel carriers, APCs, that are going to be better at close range, but they can also affect infantry with their explosive damage as well. And then you're also going to have the ATGM category. Important to note is some of these ATGMs actually do come with other crew served weapons like the M2 Browning, so they're kind of dual role. They can fight and hold off infantry while still, attacking tanks and other armored vehicles with their ATGMs. Important to note is these ATGMs do take a little bit longer. They need to maintain line of sight with their target until impact. Javelins are a little bit different. They are terminal guidance, so at a certain point they will guide onto the target no matter what. But initially they do need to have the target lock and reach around the apex until they fully go terminal guidance. So that's pretty much everything with the AT infantry. What I would really look at is, again, the stats, the damage stats on really just the damage stats. So anything really around the 400, anything higher than 400 is going to be pretty decent damage against vehicles. Anything below that is really not going to damage vehicles as much. It's going to have some effect on APCs and also IFVs, depending on their armor. But generally speaking, you want to see right around that 600 mark is decent damage. And then anything with top attack, like the Javelin we already went through, is going to receive or deal more damage because the top armor of those vehicles it is attacking are much thinner, and that damage is much more pronounced. So that is kind of the deal here. The penetration. So I've been saying damage, but it's really the penetration. Damage is still important, but when you're looking at defeating armored vehicles, you really want to look at penetration first and foremost. So moving on from the AT infantry, which we could probably spend a lot of time talking about each of these categories, we mentioned anti-air infantry. So we have the troopers AA, we have the mech riflemen AA, and really the important thing to note are these weapon systems, and then second off, how many of each of these weapon systems they have, and that really goes across on all of these things. We have the smalls that has 2 2 of these weapon systems, so they're really shooting these rounds not one at a time, but 2 at a time, and then they have the reload speed and the target acquisition time that you're going to want to also look into the magazine side. But it's really important just to know off the bat how many of these weapon systems they have per squad or per unit. So going back to the anti-air infantry, one of the important things I look at are how many stingers are we talking about, because if we have one stinger, stingers they don't deal that much damage. I think it's 80 compared to like 110 is what the equivalent Igla does for the Russians. It might be a little bit lower, like 100. But the point is the stingers aren't really that effective damage-wise. So if you have 2 of them in a squad, it's going to be much more effective. But most of them, I believe, are just 1 stinger. So important to note how many weapon systems you're dealing with. But what other weapon systems do you have? For instance, the Trooper AA I know is better because I just look at the weapon systems and you can see the number of weapon systems increases. For instance, the M203, okay, the grenade launcher, you have 2 as compared to 1 in the mech rifle AA. And then just the M4s, you have 8 compared to 5. And if you guys ever want to look at this infantry, what I should be doing, you're just going to click that little button here to pin one unit to, compare it to whatever other unit you select. So you can kind of see the side-by-side comparison. Also, the M240, you can see here, has much more penetration, same damage, but much more penetration, 10 as compared to 5, so it's almost double. So I know just outright looking at, without even going into the more in-depth weapon system by weapon system damage ratings, reload times, and magazine sizes, and really all that, what this unit kind of is at a snapshot. So I know, for instance, the Trooper AA is going to be better at also fighting infantry while still posing that AA or that manpad capability as well. But also important to note, if you're really just looking to deter helicopters, then it might be more beneficial to go with something like the mech rifleman because it's 65 points. All right, you don't want to spend 90 points in an infantry that's basically just going to sit there to deter them potentially using helicopters. You want to keep your active and inactive points you want to keep your inactive points as low as possible and your active points as high as possible. So for that reason, you can kind of weigh the pros and cons, but sometimes it is more effective to use just the mech rifle AA. Another important thing I think I mentioned with the AA units is going to be how many rounds do they have, because really, I mean, it takes probably 3 or 4 shots from the Stinger. That's counting if they actually hit every single time. Most of the times they do miss just because of the flares that the helicopters shoot, but even if they hit, let's say 3 or 4 times, that might not be enough to take down the helicopter. So if I have a Stinger that only has, and here's the only option I think I know of, the airborne Stinger team has 2 Stingers, so it's going to be double effective against helicopters. But anyways, the amount of rounds. So there's 4 rounds that this mech AA has as compared to 6. So you just got to think this mech AA might only be able to deal if it's just this one unit with 1 helicopter, and it might not even kill that helicopter. Again, it might deter that helicopter from coming into the AO or the objective, but it probably won't kill it. Now with the Troopers AA, you have 6 rounds. That's probably enough. Even with the flares and missing shots, it should be enough to at least kill 1 helicopter. So, and you also have to think resupply times, how many times you're going to have to pull those units off from being active to inactive to then resupply them. So very, very important stuff to note there as well. Our last category of infantry, like I said in the intro, is going to be the recon infantry. So there is actually, plenty of examples here. I'm not going to go into every single one of them, but there's a little bit of all the other categories in the recon infantry tab. So for instance, the Green Beret can be long range infantry depending on what kind of squad loadout you give it. And a lot of these units are the same way. The squad loadouts might change it. Let's say from CQB anti-infantry to long range infantry, as we see with the Delta units, they have the long range and the short range options. But for the Green Berets specifically, you can have the snipers option, and then these other 2 are really anti-infantry with the Punisher and the Flash are both weapon systems. I believe the Flash is actually an incendiary round, so it really burns the targets, and then you have the Punisher, which is more of a grenade launcher type weapon system that's going to also damage infantry pretty effectively. So and then you have the Rangers RRC. You can have standoff and close quarter loadouts, but the thing is with it has either the AT4 or the Maws. Both are pretty effective. One just has a little bit further range. And yeah, so basically that's going to be an AT recon infantry. So again, you have a lot of overlap, and with the new Baltic battalion, you also have a lot of different mixtures, especially within the recon. You can have AT infantry. These are all actually pretty decent. Basically, this Spike SR is pretty similar to a Javelin, actually probably better than a Javelin, but it's on a recon unit. And you have the same thing here with the Cav Scouts. You have 3 Javelin rounds, 1 Javelin weapon system here, so kind of a little bit of a crossover. The Force Recon, now that can be a combination of anti-infantry, can also fight a little bit of anti-tank or armored vehicles in general. And then you have really just the recon peer kind of stuff, like the scout snipers, that is really only good for stealth identifying units. I mean, yeah, you can load it out with an anti-material rifle, and I really wouldn't recommend that because it's 100 points per recon unit, and it does have its, uses. But again, we look at inactive points. This is kind of an inactive point, even though they are spotting. They're not really using the upgrade all that often, and if they are, they're going to be exposing themselves and probably dying soon after. So that's pretty much everything as far as the categories of infantry. I'm just going to go back and I'm going to delve into a little bit of the stats. So we kind of looked at this front stat screen, which just tells you what kind of weapon system it is, how many weapon systems they do have. So we have 6, M16s here. You have the round type, which really is not that important. It's kind of more of a detail thing. And then the amount of rounds, again, that's not super important unless it's some kind of launcher, AA launcher. Okay, then it becomes a lot more important. It is important to know that we have, for instance, 8 rounds of essentially what is a javelin, even though this is the Cat Dragon, but very important to know those amount of weapon systems, amount of rounds, especially when it comes from a launcher. If we go over here into the more in-depth details, it will tell you things like aim time, magazine size, reload. For infantry specifically, not that important, except when you look at AT infantry specifically, okay? So understand that this unit, the Airborne NGSW, is a great AT infantry, but it only has 1 launcher. So we have 6 rounds. How long will that take us to shoot those 6 rounds? If you look at here, 5 to 6 seconds. Reload time with a 1 to 2 second aim time. So you're roughly looking at 5, 6, or 7 seconds to shoot 1 round at a time. Okay, if you look at some of the other infantry units, AT infantry specifically, I'm trying to find one with more than 1 launcher. So here in the RAWs, for instance, the M3 Carl Gustav, you have 3 launchers and you have 18 rounds. So the ability to sustain itself against multiple armored vehicles and to keep on firing rounds at a consistent basis is much higher here with the RAWs as opposed to, let's say, the NGSW that can only shoot 1 round every 7 seconds. If we have 3 launchers and each of those launchers is reloading aim time, it's about the same amount of time. I think it actually is the same weapon system. Yeah, the MAWS weapon system. But anyways, it is the same weapon system, but you have 3 of them now in the squad. So if you really do the simple math, you're taking a third of the time, which we said 5, 6, 7 seconds. So really 1 round every 2 seconds if it's not shocked or panicked, which will go into suppression and those effects later. So very important to note that, and that's all information that you can kind of pull up when you hit this tab up here and, look more in depth into the weapon systems. Also important to note, I know you guys probably already all know this, but they also tell you what those rounds can target. So, this MAWS can actually target helicopters and vehicles. So, that's the big thing. Also very important, didn't mention with a anti-infantry is important to look at the launcher and see if it can target infantry. We know that it's probably more specific to anti-infantry type launcher. So that's kind of what this is saying here. Yeah, it can target vehicles, but that's not its primary purpose. The other way is not true. So, I mean, if you have a launcher that is specifically for vehicles and does not say it's infantry, then it's purely AT infantry kind of launcher. Okay, so it's pretty much everything for that, looking into kind of some of the more specifics in the detailed tab of the weapon systems, seeing if anything is really important. The ranges, obviously, are super important. Now, for the infantry specifically, and really every weapon system, you're going to want to use closer to the max effective range. So, this is a ground range of 600 meters. That's actually pretty decent ground range. I mean, some of these, so M4, they're saying it's 400 meters, okay? So this can actually outrange a lot of normal infantry by 200 meters. So that's 200 meters. If they create that standoff, they will be receiving 0 damage while they're still issuing their damage with their M7 spears, at least, for some of this other stuff like the 320, you got to be in 400 meter range. And the minimum distances, it'll say that with the effective range, is also really important. I believe that comes into play when you're looking at shotguns specifically. Let's see, effective range 200 meters, maybe it's somewhere else, but anyways, the range, you just want to make sure sometimes that minimum range does come into effect, especially I believe with the grenade launchers. 12 meters or whatever, you can't be too much closer that, and when they go into buildings, they're obviously not going to be using that. I think when you're in buildings, the assumed distance is 0 to 5 meters, so interesting to note that as well. As far as the rest of this, blast radius, not super important. The penetration stat is really saying the same thing out here, okay? So, nope, sorry, I'm looking at the same thing. It was not the same thing. So 600 meters of explosive penetration, that's the same thing that it's saying here under the penetration. Supply weight doesn't really matter. Resupply time might matter. Less so with infantry, as I believe most of it's, pretty quick. 5... Yeah, so infantry resupply is not as important. One last thing I'll say is important. It says right here, destroyed by APS. So we talked about that earlier. Most rounds, really any rocket launcher round is going to be able to get destroyed by APS, but that's just what this is. If it's positive, it means it can get destroyed by APS. So some really basic stuff just to know when you're looking at this infantry. I think that's really everything in a nutshell. One interesting thing to note, with in addition to the Baltic Battalion, the U.S. lacks in the fact that a lot of their infantry is fairly expensive, with exception to the armored brigade. A lot of that infantry is like 50 points or whatever, but it's not super effective either. The thing about the Russian infantry, it can be really cheap, but still really effective to its role. With the introduction of the Baltic Battalion, you kind of got this unit. I'm not going to try to pronounce some of these unit names, but it's versatile in that one of them's anti-infantry, one of them's anti-tank oriented, and one's kind of in between. And all that for 35 points. You can load up a transport with 5 units and ship it on its way. But yeah, the addition of the Baltic Battalion actually has some pretty good infantry, and you have these three options between the three nations that they represent. So, not going to go super in depth. If you guys want me to, I will make a separate Baltic Battalion video that will go more in depth into each of these units. One last thing on the statistics, we talked a lot about the weapon statistics, but one thing you need to look at, and it's really important to note on the infantry. So with the vehicles, you can really get away with just looking at this top information, and most people kind of understand what a 100 armor rating is, as opposed to, let's say, a 1200 armor against explosive damage, 650 against kinetic weapons. But when you go to the infantry, notice there is no numbers that are written, on the side of the tank or whatever. It's standard, it's uniform across the unit. So when you're looking at the armor points and the hit points, the really only way to understand what that means is one, play the game and kind of understand really more or less how squishy that unit is. But let's just take the airborne NGSW. I think that's a pretty good median strength unit. All right, so it's saying that it has 8 armor points. Obviously, that's going to counter the penetration given on each of these weapons. So let's say the 10 penetration on the spear and the 250. Okay, so that's what that's countering. And then it has a total hit points of 45. That's with the damage, obviously. And none of these numbers are really linear. Like, you can type it into ba.net and it'll give you kind of a estimated amount of shots it'll take, but I've done plenty of testing and none of this is linear. So, sometimes it is. If you have 100% penetration, you'll see that you'll get 8.5 damage on, let's say, a vehicle. But other than that, the ranges come into effect, the cover come into effect. There's a lot of different factors. But generally speaking, if we look at the armor, the hit points, and the number of units in that squad will give you a relative idea to, for lack of better terms, how squishy that unit is. Okay, so, that's the same as the troopers. Again, a median unit. I'd say a little bit buffier than, the average unit. But obviously, like, the buffiest unit, infantry unit that you're going to have is something like the Delta, where you have 10 armor, and then you have 60 hit points, and that's a 12-man squad. And obviously, as you receive damage and your hit points go down, you're going to lose units, and each of those units carries a weapon system. So to keep that in mind, it's going to be dealing less damage as it loses those units, if that makes sense. But yeah, just looking at some of the other units, I'm just comparing across our, kind of basic NGSW as our standard that we're comparing it to. A lot of the crew service weapon systems, you can tell, is a little bit lower hit points and armor. So you got 8 armor and 30 hit points. Okay, yeah, and the same thing with the RAWs. Like, the RAWs is super effective against AT, anti-tank, and, IFVs, but it is pretty, I would say, soft unit. So if this thing gets hit by a tank round or gets shot at by IFV, or if it's just out of cover in general, it's going to die much faster because it only has 30 hit points. The Cat Dragon's 40 over here, and then you go back up to 70. I just want to compare that real quick. So it looks like you have... Yeah, so it looks like the Marine CQC and the Delta, the Marine CQC actually has 2 more soldiers in that squad, and then it also has 10 more hit points, which is a pretty significant amount. Each of these have the standoff or the close quarter combo. I'm not going to go super into the specifics of which one I prefer, but the biggest thing for close quarter combat is you want to check to see if they have flashbang. So that's going to be the most important factor when you're doing building-to-building fighting with something like the Delta Force. So that's really everything I'm going to cover over the statistics. The other things are pretty standard across all units. The optics, so how far out they can spot. Obviously, that gets cut in half if the enemy that's spotting is in cover or in the woods. The stealth rating, that's pretty important when you go into recon. So anything, I guess, above a 2.25 stealth rating is pretty decent, but 3 is like dramatically better than 2.5. Again, it's not a linear scale. I mean, this literally is a linear scale because it just divides the distance that you are from the target and divides it by whatever this number is. But when I'm saying 3 is a lot more effective than having 2.5. And the spotting range, and then you also have the speed of the infantry unit. I really haven't paid much attention to that, if that even changes across. I think every unit has the same speed, and we'll go over suppression in a second, but very important note there on the speed. Or not very important because they're all the same. The weight, that just has to do with the resupply. I think, again, it's more of a detail thing. And then the abilities, everything has pretty much the same abilities, or everything has the sprint ability, right? But not everything will have the smoke ability. That's actually really important. Same thing with vehicles, being able to smoke, break contact. If they, if you want to try saving that unit and resupplying it, most of the time you're going to have to smoke it to get out of that. Or if it gets shocked or in a panic mode, I would smoke and withdraw that unit. Anything else? Yeah, the only other thing is like the airborne ability that's also on there. So airdrop ability, I don't use it. You can put any of these infantry units in helicopters or vehicles, and we'll go into more of that in a second. So we're going to pull up the in-game footage of kind of how this infantry is. We're going to go through a few interesting and basic infantry tactics and what you need to know there. So we'll go into the game. We'll stop talking about all the units and the theory, and we'll kind of show you what this looks like. So before I get into this kind of test replay that I have set up for you guys, you're going to see 3 different things. You're going to see one, so we have the enemy, it's the Russian units. they're going to be posted up in the buildings. Okay, those units are going to be mainly AT infantry. So we're going to be using vehicles to counter the AT infantry in the building, which typically is not a good idea unless you have standoff. We'll kind of show what the effects are of that, but important to note. All right, one of these scenarios will be with no recon, no covering fire, really nothing, just the vehicles versus the infantry. And I do hold fire here just not to give it that much of a standoff, because if it was shooting from max effective range, it's just going to outrange the infantry and it's going to win regardless. But I'm going to show you without recon, without covering fire. Then I'm going to show you with recon, and then with recon and covering fire. And then we'll also show kind of the disadvantages of using smoke against infantry when using vehicles. Smoke against infantry is good if you're countering with infantry. Just as important as the infantry that we talked about is how that infantry is getting to the location, which kind of plays into the infantry fighting vehicles and the armored personnel carriers, which we're going to see here in a second. So I'll go ahead and play it, and we'll make some comments at the end. So this iteration is going to be the recon. We're going to have the Apache provide some suppressive fire, and it's also going to do a bunch of damage. You can kind of see how much damage that Apache already does. I mean, it kills an entire unit before the Dragoons even get into range, and when they are in range, that thing is panicked and it's instantly killed. Notice how the Dragoons take little to no damage. Next up, I'm going to show you guys what it looks like when you have the recon. So we've identified the units. We're going to bring up the Dragoons. We're going to be suppressing this time with artillery. It's going to be a little bit more fair of a fight than we saw with the Apache. Okay, I'm going to actually stop the fire after a volley. You can see these units are already panicked. So they're not going to be able to fire as fast against the Dragoons. All right, the Dragoons just need to come in. Their APS is already deflected, most of it. It's not firing fast enough, and they have very little health. Again, that was only from 2 volleys of those Brutuses, and take notice on the damage there. Okay, so for this last iteration, we're going to have no recon. We're going to have no suppressive fire. We're drawing the Dragoons first off. The Dragoons do not identify the units. The units in the building have no damage from standoff or any other suppressing. They were just shocked, but they just got put into panic, and only 1 unit is at half health, and there goes your Dragoons. So both of the Dragoons are completely killed at this point. Again, that is with no covering fire, no recon, not being able to identify it beforehand. Those results from what we showed before in the other 3 iterations compared to that one are dramatically different. Okay, and lastly here we have the smoke. So the smoke with the vehicles countering the infantry in the building actually goes against what you want to do. So as you can see here, it's not until the vehicles are right up on the target that they can even target it. And honestly, it's probably hurting the vehicles more than it is helping them. So again, that is why smoke is effective when you're using IFVs to bring infantry to the fight, because the vulnerable part of the infantry is the vehicle that brings them to the fight, i.e. why you really need to use smoke. And actually, smoke is really effective if you're trying to air assault into the objective and kill infantry in the buildings as well. So important to note, and this isn't always true across every vehicle, every single situation, but as far as using smoke to clear a building with vehicles, you actually want that standoff, and using that smoke actually stops you from achieving that standoff. All right, so the first thing that we're going to observe is the AT infantry, and just taking a look at the Ranger Raws. All right, this is 3 Ranger Raws against a T-14. It's the best tank in the game, and it easily defeats that T-14 at close range, even against the frontal armor, just based off of how many rocket launchers it has and how close it is in proximity. Now we're just going to do 2 of these Raws against the BMP-3s. Now those aren't up-armored or anything, but you can see how effective the AT infantry is against vehicles, as it should be. All right, so the next thing I would like to show is the importance of providing cover, especially when your transport is going to be soft, like a soft transport. So let's say this Hemet, it's only got 10 armor, but it can hold a significant amount of units. You can hold 4 Ranger Raws, and just for purposes, we're going to bring out, and we're going to see how far this gets against the infantry that we have in this building. And remember, this infantry is AT infantry, and it's not even good at close quarter combats or anything, but we'll see how it fares against this Hemet. Without even shooting a rocket, it not only destroys the entire vehicle, it starts shooting at your infantry. Okay, this is where you would want to use your abilities like sprint and also the smoke, but you can see how quickly these units now get into a panic state, so they're pretty much combat ineffective at this point. Okay, as I'm advancing, and keep in mind this is 4 units against essentially 2 units. Okay, how much cover this one's providing here. Again, fighting the same 4 units. I'm going to fast forward. We're just going to see how this battle progresses. Okay, easily defeated. A few important notes is we had a soft skin transport bring in the infantry units. They were caught in the open, they were quickly panicked, and by the time they were able to fight to the building, they were pretty much combat ineffective. Okay, so next thing I would like to show is the AT infantry with cover up to the building and see how they perform against the units. Even though they're categorized as a AT infantry, we're going to provide them smoke cover up to the building. So that way their, vehicle or their transport doesn't get them caught in the open, and we'll see how well they perform close combat infantry to infantry. Alright, so now I'm smoking up to the objective. I'm going to use this linear smoke target. That is going to allow us to bring our infantry right up, and ideally we get the transport out. Alright, and keep in mind the number of units is going to be super important. You can absolutely outpower the units just based off of the number of units. Now, this isn't always a 100% answer, but you can see even with the close combat, yes, it's AT infantry. At this point, it's only using its M4s, but it's able to defeat pretty easily other AT infantry. Yes, it outnumbers it, but you can kind of see just the difference there. The next building over, we actually have a pair of, I think it's in this building actually as well, and we'll kind of show what this AT infantry can do against close quarter combat infantry. Okay, as you can see, the anti-infantry is already killing it pretty quickly. I mean, it's probably not even going to get into the building. As soon as it does, it gets defeated. No surprise there whatsoever. So, again, anti-infantry, infantry against anti-tank infantry is going to lose in those scenarios pretty much no matter what. The next thing I'm going to show is the importance of anti-infantry infantry against really any infantry, and how much the shocked ability and the panic ability is going to affect their combat effectiveness. So I'm going to send this Delta Force over here, and I'm just going to show you what happens when, number one, you kind of get caught out in the open. I'm not going to use a smoke. In an actual game, I would use a smoke, but just for demonstration purposes, again, this is primarily anti-tank infantry here. And as you can see, Delta Force is probably one of the best anti-infantry type infantries that you can have, and it just gets absolutely killed, okay? Absolutely destroyed, doesn't even make it to the building. Now, we're going to do the same thing as we did last time. Okay, keep in mind that this time we don't have numbers. I'm just going to send in one of the Delta Force units. So on this approach, I'm going to allow the Delta Force to, unlike the last attempt, get fairly close before storming into the building, just so that it can get the, panic and maybe even shock effect, okay? Again, also a very important thing to note is when your infantry gets shot out of a vehicle like that, it's going to take a significant amount of damage, okay? So, alright, we're going to try to get into the building, but again, before we can even get into it, it's already shocked, it's already lost most of its health, and it's just too little of a health to do any significant type of damage. Alright, so this time we're going to smoke the entire approach for the Delta. It is going to be the same infantry in this building here. And again, we're going to have a soft skin vehicle bring the infantry up to the building, and we'll see how quick and how well it fares against the AT infantry that is in the building. So it will receive no shock effect, no damage from, getting shot out of the vehicle or anything like that. Okay, look how quickly it defeats, using the anti-infantry. It's using its shotguns, it's using its flashbangs. And we go into the second building, and even though the Delta Force is actually panicked, it is still able to panic and quickly kill the Russian infantry in the building. So just an importance of not only the quality of the unit, but also, the suppression of that unit, especially when it comes to infantry. So really important is how you're transporting the infantry, where it is going. Another thing I want to hit on really quickly into this video is how to use infantry in general. So, AT infantry, CQB type infantry, as we just saw, attacking and destroying infantry in buildings is probably the most brute force way to go about it. Really, you want to use artillery to counter the infantry in the buildings. And when you put infantry in buildings or in the woods, you want it to be hidden from the enemy. So one of the most important tactics that I see that you really should do is hide your infantry behind buildings. What this is going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to peek in over the building, spot what's on the other side, especially if you know that the enemy is going to attack down a certain axis, okay? You can easily put that infantry into the building, identify the enemy on the other side, and if you can defeat it, then that's fine. If you can't, you're going to back off and you're going to run behind it. if you keep your infantry in the building, you're liable to have something like this happen, where you have standoff against, you know, some kind of vehicle that you could easily defeat, and instead of providing any damage, you're just going to get shot. So I see a lot of people just stick their infantry in buildings, and this is what happens. They just get shot to death by whatever vehicle. And then if you also keep your infantry in one spot way too long, the enemy is going to start bombing that building. So another quick tactic that you can use is you can hold the shift key down, and you can actually jump back and forth between buildings, kind of like this. I'm clicking to the different buildings, and they'll keep rotating. Again, that's just to keep your units moving, keep the enemy guessing as far as artillery. This doesn't always work perfectly, but especially if you want to just go back and forth between the two buildings, that is really important, is just how you're orienting your infantry in these buildings. Also, you really want to use AT infantry in urban areas, because you want to force the enemy to, unless they have smoke or whatever, they're going to use these vehicles to kind of happen upon an ambush. So just an example, if I have these dragoons, they're not able to establish their real standoff. You know, imagine there's even more buildings of this, but we still don't have line of sight onto what we know is there's infantry in this building, and here they go. They kind of get ambushed here. So important to note that, you know, anti-tank infantry is super effective, especially in urban areas, and especially if it's undiscovered. So hey, you guys, that's everything I have for you today in this infantry guide. Hopefully you guys learned something. If you did, please drop a like, drop a comment, follow General Johnny's strategy for more Broken Arrow content, strategy content. We go over all that, tactics and more. So without further ado, I will see you next time.